You're sitting close enough to a fire that you can feel it on your face. It's 50,000 BC. The night is enormous and completely dark beyond the circle of light you're in. And somewhere out there, things are moving. You can hear them. Everyone in the group can hear them. There are maybe 15, maybe 20 of you, pressed close together, shoulders almost touching, and the fire is the only reason any of you are still alive right now. You've been out since before dawn. Someone almost didn't make it back. The group is tired in a way that goes deeper than muscle, the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and makes everything feel slightly unreal. And then someone opens their mouth and starts to speak. Here's the question nobody thinks to ask. Who was that person? Not what they said, not even why they said it. Who, in that specific group, at that specific moment, had the standing to break the silence first? Who was allowed to speak before everyone else without risking something? Because in a small group of humans living at the absolute edge of survival, words were not free. They never have been. Opening your mouth was a social act with real consequences. And in a world without courts, without police, without any institutional structure whatsoever, the consequences of getting it wrong were immediate and personal and occasionally fatal. We spend a lot of time thinking about ancient human life in terms of what people did. They hunted, they gathered, they made tools, they painted caves. We reconstruct the physical record with extraordinary care and precision. We can tell you what a Neanderthal ate for dinner 40,000 years ago based on isotope ratios in fossilized teeth. We know what kind of ochre pigment was used in specific cave paintings and where that ochre was sourced geographically. We are genuinely remarkable at reading the physical traces of the past. But we almost never ask about the social architecture. The invisible structure that organized every interaction, every decision, every moment of shared life in those groups. And the most basic unit of social architecture, the most fundamental thing humans do that separates us from every other animal on the planet, is talk. We are the talking animal. Language is not something humans have, it's something humans are. And inside every conversation, in every group of humans that has ever existed, there is a grammar of power running underneath the actual words. A set of rules, usually unspoken, that governs who talks, when they talk, how long they talk, and crucially, who goes first. That last question is the one that interests me, because whoever spoke first in an ancient human group wasn't just making a sound. They were doing something social. They were asserting something, claiming something, or fulfilling an expectation that the rest of the group had already placed on them. The first voice in any gathering sets the frame. It establishes what kind of moment this is going to be. It signals to everyone else how to orient themselves. And the person whose voice that is did not end up in that position by accident. The easy answer, the one your brain probably jumped to immediately, is that the strongest person spoke first. The alpha, the chief, the big guy with the biggest spear and the most impressive scar. That's the story we've inherited from decades of a very specific kind of pop science. The kind that imagined prehistoric humans as essentially violent chimpanzees with slightly better tools. Dominance hierarchies. Silverback logic. The loudest voice belongs to the one who can back it up physically. Except that's not quite what the evidence shows. And the evidence, when you actually dig into it, is far stranger and more interesting than the simple story. Here's the thing about small-scale human societies, the kind of groups our ancestors actually lived in for the vast majority of our evolutionary history. Groups of 15 to 50 individuals, highly mobile, deeply interdependent, where every single person's survival depended on the cooperation and goodwill of every other person. In those groups, raw physical dominance was a surprisingly fragile basis for authority, because in a small group, the biggest guy can be voted off the island. Not literally, not with a ballot, but effectively. He can be gossiped about until his reputation collapses. He can be excluded from food sharing. He can be abandoned during a migration. He can be quietly removed from the gene pool in any number of ways that don't require anyone to fight him directly. Anthropologists have documented this pattern across hunter-gatherer societies that survived into the modern era. It's called reverse dominance hierarchy, and it means that the social structure of small human groups was not in fact a simple pyramid with the strongest at the top. It was something considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. So if not the strongest, then who? Who was allowed to speak first? Who had the standing, the social permission, the accumulated trust of the group to open their mouth before everyone else and have the room follow them? The answer turns out to depend on what kind of moment it was. And that distinction, what kind of moment it was, is where the real story begins. Let's start with what anthropologists actually know about small human groups, because the data here is genuinely surprising, and most people have never encountered it. For the better part of the 20th century, the dominant model of prehistoric social organization was borrowed almost entirely from primate research, specifically from chimpanzee research. Chimps have clear dominance hierarchies. The alpha male controls resources, controls reproduction, controls who eats and when. He is loud, he is aggressive, and he goes first, always. So when researchers started trying to reconstruct early human social life, they reached for the nearest available template, and chimp logic became the default framework for understanding prehistoric human groups. The problem is that humans are not chimps. We share about 98.2% of our DNA with chimpanzees, which sounds like a lot until you realize that the 1.3% difference contains language, cooking, long-term planning, abstract symbolic thought, and the entire history of human civilization. That 1.3% is doing a lot of work, and one of the things it produced is a social structure that diverges from chimp hierarchy in ways that are fundamental and not superficial. Christopher Boehm is an anthropologist at USC who spent decades studying the question of authority in small-scale human societies. He looked at the ethnographic record across hundreds of hunter-gatherer groups documented by researchers over the past century and a half. Groups in Africa, in the Amazon, in Australia, in the Arctic. Groups with wildly different languages, different environments, different subsistence strategies. And what he found, the pattern that emerged consistently across almost all of them, was something he called the hierarchy of the humble. In group after group, the individuals who held genuine social authority were not the ones who demanded it loudly. They were the ones who had accumulated something more durable than physical strength. They had accumulated knowledge, track record, demonstrated judgment under pressure. The elder who remembered the drought of 40 years ago and knew where water could still be found. The hunter who had led 3 successful expeditions into territory nobody else knew well. The woman who had delivered every baby born in the group over the past decade and had never lost a mother. These were the people whose voices carried weight. Not because they were the biggest or the loudest, but because when they spoke, they had repeatedly proven to be worth listening to. And crucially, in many of these societies, the people with the most genuine authority were also the most careful about not appearing to seek it. There is a pattern documented so consistently across hunter-gatherer groups that researchers gave it a name. It's called demand sharing combined with achieved prestige suppression, which is academic language for something very simple. The people who actually matter in the group are the ones who visibly downplay their own importance. A hunter who comes back with a kill and brags about it loses status. A hunter who comes back with a kill and immediately starts giving the meat away and attributing his success to luck gains status. The social logic is inverted from what we expect. What this means for our question, for who spoke first, is that the answer was almost never obvious from the outside. It was not the person sitting in the biggest seat or wearing the most impressive ornaments, though status signaling certainly existed. It was the person to whom the group had extended a kind of invisible credit, a running account of trust built up through accumulated experience that entitled them to speak before others in that specific context. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because that context mattered enormously. The person who spoke first in a crisis was not necessarily the same person who spoke first during a planning discussion, who was not necessarily the same person who spoke first during a ritual. Ancient human groups were not simple monocultures of authority with one person running everything. The evidence suggests something considerably more fluid and situational. Different people held different kinds of knowledge, and different moments called for different kinds of knowledge. And the group, largely unconsciously, oriented toward whoever held the relevant expertise for that specific moment. The Hadza of Tanzania are one of the most studied surviving hunter-gatherer populations on Earth. Researchers have spent decades documenting their social dynamics, and what they describe is a decision-making process that looks almost nothing like a formal hierarchy. When the group needs to decide something, people talk. Everyone who has something relevant to say, says it. The conversation continues until something like consensus emerges. There is no vote. There is no moment where the chief stands up and announces the decision. There is just talking, and then there is agreement, and then there is action. But within that apparently flat structure, certain voices consistently carry more weight. Certain people are listened to more carefully. Certain contributions shift the conversation in ways that others do not. The hierarchy exists. It is just implicit rather than explicit, earned rather than inherited, situational rather than absolute. Which means that whoever spoke first in an ancient human group was performing something more complex than we usually imagine. They were not simply exercising power. They were reading the room. They were assessing what kind of moment this was, what kind of knowledge it required, and whether their own accumulated credit with the group was sufficient to spend on this particular moment. Speaking first was not just a right, it was a calculation, and getting that calculation wrong had consequences that the people sitting around that fire understood in their bones. Here is something that almost never makes it into the popular accounts of prehistoric social life. In many small human groups, speaking first was not a privilege. It was a risk. Think about what it actually means to be the first voice in a group that is trying to make a decision. You are committing to a position before you know what anyone else thinks. You are exposing your reasoning to a room full of people who are all simultaneously evaluating not just your idea, but your judgment, your read of the situation, your social awareness. If you are wrong, everyone sees it in real time. If you misread the mood of the group, if you push for a course of action that the rest of the room instinctively rejects, you have not just made an error, you have made a public error. And in a group of 15 to 50 people where your survival depends entirely on your standing with those specific individuals, a public error is not a minor inconvenience. It is a withdrawal from the most important account you have. This is why silence in ancient human groups was not simply the absence of speech. It was a social instrument. And the people who understood how to use it were often the most sophisticated social operators in the group. Ethnographers studying the Piraha people of the Brazilian Amazon have documented something that stops most Western observers cold. The Piraha have an almost radical commitment to present tense experience. They don't speak much about things they haven't personally witnessed. They don't spend a lot of time in abstract speculation. And in group discussions, silence is not uncomfortable. It is normal. It is expected. Periods of quiet are not gaps to be filled. They are part of the conversation. The person who rushes to fill every silence is not seen as engaged or enthusiastic. They are seen as someone who does not know how to listen. Someone whose need to talk is outrunning their actual knowledge. And that perception carries social cost. The San people of the Kalahari, some of the most extensively documented hunter-gatherers on Earth, show a similar pattern. Researchers who have spent years living among San communities describe decision-making discussions that can stretch across hours, sometimes days, with long stretches of apparent inactivity between contributions. People sit, people think, people wait, and then someone speaks. And the quality of attention that speech receives is proportional to how long that person has been silent and how carefully they have been listening to everyone else. The person who has not spoken yet carries more potential authority than the person who has been talking continuously. because silence signals that you are still gathering information, still weighing, still taking the measure of the moment before committing to a position. There is a concept in social psychology called costly signaling. The basic idea is that signals are only credible when they are expensive to fake. A peacock's tail is a reliable signal of genetic fitness precisely because only a genuinely healthy peacock can afford to grow one. In the social economy of ancient human groups, strategic silence may have functioned as a costly signal. Staying quiet when you had something to say, resisting the pull to fill space with your own voice, demonstrated a kind of self-regulation and patience that itself communicated competence. It said, "I am not desperate for your attention. I am waiting until I have something worth saying, and when I speak, it will be worth your time to listen." This creates a paradox that runs right through the center of our question. The people most entitled to speak first were often the people least likely to do so. The accumulated authority that gave someone the right to open their mouth before everyone else was built, in part, through a long practice of not doing exactly that. Which means, the social grammar of who spoke first in ancient human groups was not a simple rule. It was an ongoing dynamic negotiation, constantly recalibrated based on context, history, and the specific pressures of each moment. And then there's the category that almost everyone overlooks entirely: the ritual specialists. The people we might loosely call shamans, healers, knowledge keepers, though none of those words quite captures what they actually were in these groups. In many documented hunter-gatherer societies, the individual responsible for managing the group's relationship with the supernatural world occupied a completely separate lane of authority from the individual who led hunts or mediated disputes. Their right to speak, and specifically their right to speak first in ritual contexts, was not based on demonstrated practical competence in the conventional sense. It was based on access to knowledge, to experience, to a domain of reality that the rest of the group could not directly observe or evaluate. This is significant because it suggests that ancient human groups recognized at least two distinct kinds of authority operating simultaneously: practical authority, earned through demonstrated effectiveness in the visible world, and sacred authority, earned through a different and less verifiable process that the group nonetheless took seriously. And the person who held sacred authority could speak first in moments where practical authority was silent. Where the hunt leader had no relevant expertise, the knowledge keeper did. Where the experienced elder had no framework for what was happening, the ritual specialist stepped into the vacuum. The picture that emerges from all of this is not a simple hierarchy with a single person at the top whose voice always went first. It is something considerably more textured. A shifting, contextual, continuously renegotiated system in which the right to speak first was less like a permanent title and more like a temporary grant, extended by the group based on who they collectively believed held the most relevant knowledge for this specific moment. Which means that the first voice you heard around that ancient fire was carrying information on two levels simultaneously: the content of what was being said, and the social fact of who was saying it and why the group had given them that space. Both of those things mattered, and the people sitting in that circle understood the second one at least as well as the first. Now bring it back to right now. You are sitting in a conference room, or on a Zoom call where three people have their cameras off and one person has a background that is clearly a beach they are not actually at. Or maybe you are at a dinner table with people you have known for years, and someone has just asked a question that the whole table needs to answer together. And there is that moment, that specific suspended moment before anyone speaks, where everyone is simultaneously waiting and evaluating and deciding whether this is their moment or someone else's. You know exactly what that moment feels like. Everyone does. Because that moment is not modern. That moment is not a product of office culture or social media anxiety or anything that was invented in the last 500 years. That moment is 50,000 years old at minimum, and the hardware running it inside your head was built long before you were born, long before your grandparents were born, long before anyone who has ever been remembered by name walked the earth. The silence before the first voice in a group is one of the oldest experiences in the human repertoire. And the calculation happening inside everyone sitting in that silence. Should I speak? Do I have enough standing here? Is this my moment? What happens if I get this wrong? That calculation is the same one that ran in the minds of people sitting around fires in the African savannah before any of the civilizations you learned about in school existed. The specific content has changed beyond recognition. The underlying social architecture has not changed at all. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Because we tend to think of ourselves as people who have moved past all of that. We have institutions, we have procedures, we have org charts and meeting agendas and Robert's Rules of Order. We have created elaborate formal structures specifically designed to regulate who speaks and when and for how long, precisely because we recognized at some level that the informal version of that process was too unpredictable, too vulnerable to manipulation, too dependent on dynamics that we could not fully see or control. And those structures do real work. They matter. But they sit on top of something older that never went away. Every formal meeting procedure in the world is running on top of a social operating system that was installed in the human brain long before formal meetings existed. And that operating system is still active. It is running right now. It shapes who actually speaks first, regardless of what the agenda says. It shapes whose contributions land and whose get talked over. It shapes the invisible credibility assessments that happen in the first 30 seconds of any group interaction, the ones that determine who the room is actually going to listen to before a single substantive word has been exchanged. The research on this is both extensive and deeply uncomfortable. Studies of group decision-making consistently show that the person who speaks first in a leaderless group discussion has a disproportionate influence on the outcome. Not because their ideas are necessarily better, but because the first voice sets the frame. It establishes the terms of the conversation. It signals to everyone else what kind of discussion this is going to be, and what kinds of contributions are appropriate within it. The first voice in a room is doing something structural, not just communicative. And the people who understand this intuitively, who have internalized the social grammar of the first voice, have an advantage that most people around them cannot quite name, but can absolutely feel. And here is where it connects directly back to what we learned about ancient human groups. Because the people who were best at navigating that grammar in prehistoric societies were not the people who simply seized the floor. They were the people who understood when to speak and when to stay silent, who had built enough accumulated credit with their group that when they did speak, the room was already leaning toward them before the first sentence was finished, who read the specific context of each moment carefully enough to know whether this was their turn or someone else's. That skill has not become less relevant. It has become more relevant. Because modern humans are operating in more groups simultaneously, navigating more complex social environments, managing more relationships with more people than any of our ancestors ever had to, the number of rooms we are in, literal and metaphorical, has exploded. But the ancient social software is the same software. It was not updated for conference calls. It was not patched to handle the specific dynamics of a Slack channel or a group text or a comment section. It is running ancient code on modern problems, and the results are sometimes brilliant and sometimes a complete disaster. What ancient human groups understood, even without the vocabulary to articulate it, was that the first voice was never just one person's decision. It was a transaction between the speaker and the group. The speaker was making a claim, and the group was deciding whether to honor it. And the groups that got that transaction right, that developed good collective instincts for whose voice to follow in which moment, those groups made better decisions. They survived situations that other groups did not. They navigated uncertainty more effectively because they had figured out how to route the right knowledge to the surface at the right moment. We are still doing that, right now. In every room you walk into today, that transaction is happening. Someone's voice is going to go first, and the question of whose voice it is and whether the group is right to give that person that space and what it costs everyone in the room when the wrong voice goes first, those questions are not ancient history. They are the texture of daily life. They are happening in the meeting you have this afternoon, and the dinner you are going to this weekend, and every group conversation you will have for the rest of your life. 50,000 years ago, someone opened their mouth first around a fire in the dark. The whole group turned toward that voice. Something in the air shifted, and the question of whether that was the right voice, whether the group's instinct to follow it was sound, that question had consequences that rippled outward in ways nobody sitting in that circle could have traced or predicted. Nothing about that has changed. Only the fire is different.